I watched the red laser dot of a tactical rifle dance across my husband's chest, right over the pocket where he carried our daughter's first drawing. My sister Cynthia stood behind the lead officer, her face a mask of manufactured horror, as she pointed a shaking finger at the man she had shared Thanksgiving dinner with just months before. She knew exactly who he was, and she knew the badge in his jacket made him a decorated federal agent. But that was the point. She needed him neutralized, branded a threat, and scrubbed from the board before the sun went down on the most lucrative betrayal of my life. By the time the airline realized they had just tackled an FBI operative on a domestic flight based on the fabricated hysterics of a flight attendant, the damage was done, and my sister was already at the bank, trying to liquidate the life I had spent 15 years building. For a long time, my life felt like a series of soft, muted colors. We lived in a house that smelled perpetually of cedarwood and expensive coffee, a sprawling colonial on the edge of a quiet Virginia suburb. My husband, Mark, was the kind of man who moved through the world with a quiet, grounded authority. To our neighbors, he was a high-level corporate consultant who traveled a lot for boring logistics meetings. In reality, he was a senior field agent for the FBI's white-collar crime division. It was a secret we kept like a precious heirloom, tucked away behind the mundane rituals of suburban life. I remember the way the light would hit the kitchen island on Sunday mornings, casting long, golden rectangles across the marble. Mark would be there, his large hands wrapped around a ceramic mug, pretending to read the financial news while actually watching our 7-year-old daughter, Mia, try to negotiate for an extra pancake. "If you eat the blueberries first, we can talk about a chocolate chip upgrade," he'd say, his voice a low rumble that always made me feel safe. That safety was my oxygen. I had grown up in a chaotic, crumbling household where the electricity was a luxury and my mother's moods were the weather, so I had built this life like a fortress. Cynthia was the only crack in the walls, but for years I chose to see her as a decorative feature rather than a structural flaw. She was my younger sister, 5 years my junior, and she had always possessed a certain frantic, glittering energy. While I worked my way through a stable career in architectural design, Cynthia bounced from one grand opportunity to another, usually leaving a trail of unpaid debts and burnt bridges behind her. "Elena, you have to understand, I'm just not meant for a cubicle," she'd tell me, sitting on my plush velvet sofa, nursing a glass of wine she hadn't paid for. "I need to see the world. I need to be where the action is." I was the one who practically filled out her application for the airline. I was the one who coached her through the interviews, bought her the professional clothes, and even used Mark's consulting connections to ensure her background check went through without a hitch, despite a messy shoplifting charge from her college years. When she finally donned that crisp, navy blue flight attendant uniform, I felt a surge of sisterly pride. I thought I had finally fixed her. I thought she was finally safe, which meant I was safe. The center of our world, the asset that Cynthia had been eyeing since the day our mother passed away, wasn't just my house. It was the Old Mill Farm, a 100-acre estate in the Shenandoah Valley that had been in our family for 4 generations. My mother had bypassed Cynthia and left the entire property to me in a move that I knew even then was a ticking time bomb. The farm was worth millions, not just for the land, but for the mineral rights Mark had discovered were being quietly scouted by energy companies. "You know, it's not really fair, Len," Cynthia had remarked one evening, her eyes fixed on the deed I was filing away in my home office. She was leaning against the doorframe, her flight attendant scarf loosened, looking tired but predatory. Mom was out of her mind at the end. She didn't know what she was signing. 100 acres is a lot for one person to hoard. "I'm not hoarding it, Synth," I replied, trying to keep my tone light. "I'm preserving it. I want Mia to have a place where the air actually smells like grass, not exhaust. And besides, I told you, you're welcome there any time. There's a guest cottage with your name on it."
She didn't smile. She just watched me lock the drawer. A guest cottage. Right, because I'm a guest in this family, aren't I? Always looking in through the window. I should have heard the venom in her voice then. I should have seen the way her gaze lingered on the safe.
But Mark was coming home that night, and the house was filled with the smell of roasting chicken and rosemary, and I was too wrapped up in my own version of perfect to notice the foundation was beginning to rot. The week before the flight, things started to feel off. Cynthia, who usually called me 3 times a day to complain about her layovers or her lack of alimony from her third ex-husband, went silent. When she did call, her questions were strangely specific. "So Mark is definitely taking the 6 a.m. flight out of Dallas on Thursday?" she asked, her voice crackling over a bad connection from a hotel in Chicago. "Yeah, he's coming back from that logistics conference early," I told her, tucking the phone between my shoulder and ear as I packed Mia's lunch. "He's actually bringing the original copies of the farm's mineral surveys. We have a meeting with the estate lawyer on Friday morning to put the land into a permanent trust. Why do you ask?" "Oh, no reason," she said, her voice dropping into a silky, distracted hum. "Just checking. I think I'm working that route. It would be funny if he ended up on my plane, right? Family reunion at 30,000 feet." "That would be nice," I said, completely oblivious. "He'd love a friendly face. He's been exhausted lately." "I'll make sure he gets exactly what's coming to him, Elena," she whispered. "I'll make sure he's taken care of." I hung up, feeling a warm glow of sisterly affection. I thought she was trying to be kind. I thought she was finally growing up. I didn't realize that she had already spent the last month coordinating with a disgraced notary and a shady real estate developer to forge my signature on a bill of sale. All she needed was a 12-hour window where neither I nor Mark could intervene. All she needed was for my husband, a man the government had trained to be a ghost, to become a high-profile target. The morning of the flight, the air was heavy with an approaching storm. I walked Mark to the door, adjusting his tie one last time. He looked handsome, steady, his briefcase heavy with the documents that would protect our daughter's future forever. "I'll see you at the gate?" he asked, kissing my forehead. "I'll be there," I promised, with a sign that says, "World's Best Logistics Consultant" in big, sparkly letters. He laughed, that deep, grounding sound I loved so much, and walked out into the grey morning light. I stood in the doorway, watching his taillights disappear, unaware that the next time I saw him, he would be face down on the floor of a Boeing 737, and my sister would be the one screaming for the police. The silence that settled over the house after Mark left wasn't the usual peaceful hum of a sleeping home. It felt thin, like a sheet of ice stretched too far. I went through the motions of a normal morning, making Mia's breakfast, checking her backpack for her homework, brushing her hair, but my skin felt prickly, as if the air itself was charged with static. The first clink in the armor of my reality happened at 9:15 a.m. I was clearing the breakfast dishes when the landline rang. We almost never used the landline. It was mostly for telemarketers and my grandmother's old friends. "Hello?" I said, wiping a stray drop of syrup from the counter. "Is this Elena Thorne?" a woman's voice asked. She sounded brisk, professional, and slightly impatient. "This is Janice from the county clerk's office. I'm just following up on the expedited filing for the old mill property. There was a slight smudge on the notary seal of the third page, and we need a clear copy before we can finalize the transfer to the holding company." I froze, the dishcloth suspended in midair. "I'm sorry? The transfer? There must be some mistake. We haven't filed any papers for a transfer. The property is being put into a trust tomorrow." There was a long pause on the other end, the sound of papers shuffling. "That's not what I have here, Mrs. Thorne. I have a signed bill of sale and a quitclaim deed dated 2 days ago. It's being transferred to Apex Valley Holdings. Your sister, Cynthia, was the one who dropped off the physical copies. She said you were in a rush to close before the weekend." My heart didn't just skip a beat. It seemed to stop entirely,
then restart with a violent, thudding rhythm that echoed in my ears. Cynthia. She brought those in. Yes, she had your power of attorney on file. Is there an issue? I hung up without answering. My hands were shaking so violently that I dropped the phone, and it clattered onto the hardwood floor with a sound like a gunshot. Power of attorney. I had never given Cynthia power of attorney.
I had given her a key to the house, just in case she needed a place to stay between flights, and I had given her access to my mother's old medical records when she was sick. I hadn't given her my life. I ran to my home office, my breath coming in shallow, jagged gasps. I dove toward the small, fireproof safe I kept in the bottom drawer of my desk. Mark and I kept our most vital documents there. I punched in the code, Mia's birthday, and the electronic lock gave a mocking, melodic beep as it swung open. It was empty. Not just the deed to the farm, everything. Our passports, our marriage certificate, the original surveys of the land's mineral rights, and the backup drive containing the encrypted logs of Mark's fieldwork. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the stomach, a sickening wave of nausea that forced me to lean my forehead against the cold metal of the desk. She had been here. While I was taking Mia to her swim lesson on Tuesday, Cynthia had been in my house, using her key, probably using a code breaker she'd bought on some dark corner of the internet. Or maybe she just watched me type the code 100 times from the doorway. I grabbed my cell phone to call Mark. He needed to know. He was an investigator. He would know how to stop this. I dialed his number, but it went straight to voicemail. Of course, he was on the plane. He had probably just reached cruising altitude. I checked the flight tracker app on my phone. Flight 402 was over the Ohio River Valley, 30,000 feet in the air. I sent him a frantic text. Mark, call me the second you land. Cynthia took everything from the safe. She's trying to sell the farm. Please, something is very wrong. I didn't get a reply. What I got instead was a notification from a news app I forgot I even had. It was a breaking news alert, and the headline felt like a cold blade sliding between my ribs. Security incident on board Flight 402. Passenger subdued after threatening crew. My world didn't just tilt, it inverted. I stumbled to the living room and fumbled for the TV remote, my fingers feeling like lead weights. I flipped to a local news channel, and there it was. A grainy, vertical video taken from a cell phone. The perspective was from the back of a plane. I saw a woman in a navy blue uniform, Cynthia, standing in the aisle, her face twisted in a look of rehearsed operatic terror. She was pointing toward a seat in the middle of the cabin. "He has a weapon," she was screaming, her voice shrill even through the poor audio quality. "He told me he's going to take down the plane. He says he's federal, but he's lying. Help me." The camera panned. I saw Mark. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't even standing. He was sitting perfectly still, his hands visible and empty, his face a mask of calm, professional confusion. He was trying to talk to the man in the seat next to him, trying to de-escalate. But then, two other male passengers, fueled by the adrenaline of Cynthia's screams, tackled him from behind. The video showed Mark being slammed into the floor of the aisle. I heard his head hit the plastic trim of a seat with a sickening thud. Cynthia was in the background, her hands over her mouth, but I knew her. I knew the way her eyes darted to the side when she was winning a game. She wasn't scared. She was performing. The news anchor's voice broke through my paralysis. Reports indicate the passenger claimed to be an FBI agent to intimidate the crew. A flight attendant alerted the pilots, who have declared an emergency landing. Local police and federal authorities are waiting on the tarmac at the nearest diversion point. I felt the room begin to spin.
The air in my lungs felt like sand. I collapsed onto the sofa, my legs finally giving out. The point of no return wasn't a line I had crossed. It was a cliff I had been pushed over. Cynthia wasn't just stealing the land, she was neutralizing the only person who could legally stop her. By branding Mark a terrorist or an unstable passenger mid-flight, she was ensuring he would be detained, questioned, and his credentials scrutinized for hours, if not days. In the world of high-stakes land transfers, 48 hours was an eternity. By the time Mark proved who he was, the money from the sale would be in an offshore account, and the farm, our daughter's legacy, would be in the hands of a shell corporation that would strip it bare before we could even file a lawsuit. I looked at the TV screen, at the image of my husband being pinned down by 3 men while my sister played the victim. The physical shock was so intense, I felt a cold sweat break out across my neck. My skin went pale, my vision tunneling until all I could see was the red "Breaking News" banner. But then, something shifted.
Inside the hollow, terrified shell of the woman I had been 5 minutes ago, a spark of pure, white-hot fury ignited. I saw the folder Cynthia had left behind on my desk in her haste. A single yellow sticky note stuck to the back of a forged document. It was a phone number with a name scrawled next to it. Apex, Mr. Vance, 11 a.m., final sign-off. It was 10:15 a.m. I stood up. The trembling in my hands didn't stop, but it changed. It wasn't fear anymore. It was the vibration of an engine starting up. I went to the kitchen, grabbed my car keys, and looked at the picture of Mia on the fridge. "Not today, Cynthia," I whispered, my voice sounding like someone else's, someone harder, someone colder. "Not today." The drive to the corporate offices of Apex Valley Holdings felt like a descent into a fever dream. Rain lashed against my windshield, the wipers struggling to keep up with the deluge, much like my mind was struggling to process the sheer scale of Cynthia's malice. My phone sat in the cup holder, silent and terrifying. Mark was still in custody. The news had updated. The disruptive passenger was being held in a federal facility pending a background check, as his claims of being an FBI agent were being treated as part of a potential hijacking ruse. My husband, a man who had spent his life protecting this country, was being treated like a monster because my sister had learned exactly which buttons to press. The Apex office was a glass and steel monolith in a high-end business park. It looked like the kind of place where souls were traded for equity. I didn't wait for the receptionist to greet me. I pushed past the mahogany desk, my wet trench coat dripping on the pristine cream carpet. "Mrs. Thorne, you can't go back there," the receptionist called out, but I was already at the heavy double doors of the main conference room. I swung them open. The air inside was cool and smelled of expensive cologne and ozone. Cynthia was there, sitting at a long glass table. She looked different. She had shed her flight attendant uniform for a sharp, tailored black suit I'd never seen before. Next to her was a man in his 50s with silver hair and a smile that didn't reach his eyes, Mr. Vance. And sitting across from them, to my horror, was Julian Vane, our family's estate lawyer, the man who had sat at my mother's bedside when she passed. "Elena," Cynthia said, her voice smooth and devoid of the hysterics I'd seen on the news. She didn't even stand up. "You're late. We were just finishing the final signatures." "Final signatures for what, Cynthia?" I walked to the table, my hands flat on the glass, leaning in until I could see the tiny, frantic pulse in her neck. "For the land you're stealing? For the life you're destroying? I saw the news. I saw what you did to Mark." Cynthia sighed, a sound of exaggerated pity. "Mark did that to himself, Elena. He's been under so much pressure. All that logistics work." He snapped. "I was just the unlucky person who had to deal with it at 30,000 feet. The airline is already preparing a settlement for my trauma. Trauma? I choked out the word, a bitter laugh bubbling in my throat. You framed him. You knew exactly who he was, and you used the one place where he couldn't defend himself without looking like a threat. Why? Because you wouldn't share, Elena, she snapped, her mask finally slipping. Her eyes were hard, glittering with a lifetime of resentment. Mom gave you the farm, the house, the stability. She gave me a good luck and a pat on the head. I'm just balancing the scales. Mr. Vance here is offering a price that will make sure I never have to serve a tiny bag of pretzels to a rude businessman ever again. Julian, I turned to the lawyer, my voice trembling. You know this is wrong. You know those documents are forged. I never gave her power of attorney. Julian Vane wouldn't look at me. He adjusted his glasses, his gaze fixed on a spot somewhere near my shoulder. Actually, Elena, the power of attorney isn't forged. It was signed by your mother 6 months before she died. It was a secondary filing, held in escrow. It gave Cynthia authority over the farm specifically, in the event that you proved unable to manage the mineral rights. The first twist hit me like a physical punch. My mother? She had done this? That's impossible. She was on heavy medication. She didn't know what she was signing. She knew I'd take care of it, Cynthia whispered, leaning forward. She knew you'd just let it sit there and rot because you're so obsessed with preserving things. I'm turning it into something useful. Money. And Mark? I asked, my voice a low, dangerous hiss. Was putting him in a federal cell part of Mom's plan too? Cynthia smirked. Mark is a complication. He knows too much about the law. I needed him out of the way for 48 hours. By the time he's released with a sincere apology from the FAA, the sale will be closed, the funds will be moved through Apex's offshore accounts, and the farm will be a memory. And don't bother calling the police, Elena. They're a bit busy at the airport right now, thanks to my bravery. You're a monster, I said, the words feeling heavy and cold in my mouth. I'm a realist, she countered. She slid a document across the table towards me. Actually, I'm glad you're here. To make this ironclad and stop any future litigation, Mr. Vance is offering you a nuisance fee. $100,000. You sign a non-disclosure and a waiver of interest, and we forget this ever happened. You go back to your quiet life, and I go to the south of France. I looked at the paper. Then I looked at Mr. Vance, who was checking his gold watch, and Julian, who was still avoiding my eyes. My husband was being interrogated. My daughter was at home waiting for a father who might not come back for days, and my sister was offering me a bribe with my own inheritance. What if I don't sign? I asked. Cynthia's face darkened. Then things get ugly. I've already told the airline's legal team that Mark has been erratic at home. I've hinted at domestic issues. If you fight me on this, I'll make sure that disruptive passenger charge sticks. I'll testify that he's been threatening me for months. His career at the bureau? Over. His reputation? Gone. You really want to trade your husband's freedom for a bunch of dirt and trees in the valley? This was the second twist, the knife in the back. She wasn't just stealing the land, she was holding Mark's entire life hostage. She knew that if I fought her, she'd drag him down with her, using her victim status as a shield. I looked at the pen sitting on the table. It was a heavy silver thing. My hand reached for it, and for a second, I saw the triumph flare in Cynthia's eyes. She thought I was broken. She thought the safe sister had finally been cornered. I picked up the pen, but I didn't sign. I gripped it so hard my knuckles turned white, and I looked at Mr. Vance. Your Apex Valley holdings? I asked, my voice eerily calm. I am, he said, sounding bored. And you've done your due diligence on these mineral rights? You've seen the surveys Mark brought back? We've seen the copies Cynthia provided, Vance said. Those copies are 3 years old, I said, a slow, cold smile spreading across my face. The third twist, Cynthia? You should have stayed in the safe. Mark didn't bring back surveys on that flight. He brought back an environmental seizure order. The EPA found a massive runoff of toxic chemicals from the neighboring chemical plant on the north border of the farm last month. The land is legally condemned for the next 20 years. It's not worth millions. It's a liability worth exactly 0. The silence in the room became deafening. Cynthia's eyes widened, her face draining of colour. You're lying. You're just trying to stop the sale. Ask Julian, I said, nodding toward the lawyer whose face had gone from pale to grey. Julian, did you check the updated EPA registry before you brought these papers here today? Or were you too busy counting your commission? Julian's hands started to shake. He pulled out his phone, his fingers fumbling. Mr. Vance stood up, his bored expression replaced by a look of predatory, sharp focus. If this land is under a seizure order, this contract is fraudulent. It's not! Cynthia screamed, jumping to her feet. She's lying! Elena, shut up! She lunged across the table to grab the documents, but I was faster. I swept the papers off the desk and stepped back, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. It's over, Cynthia, I said, my voice echoing in the glass room. You destroyed Mark's life for a pile of poisoned dirt, and now I'm going to make sure the world knows exactly what kind of hero you really are. I stood there in that sterile glass box of an office, and for the first time in my life, I felt the click. It wasn't a loud noise, but a silent, icy shift deep within my chest. The woman who had spent years making excuses for Cynthia, who had bailed her out of debt and smoothed over her lies, died in that moment. In her place was someone I didn't quite recognize, someone who realized that mercy is a luxury you can't afford when you're dealing with a snake. You're bluffing, Cynthia spat, her voice cracking as she looked at Mr. Vance, who was now frantically typing on his laptop. She's lying. Julian, tell them the land is fine. Julian Vane looked like he was about to have a heart attack. I didn't run a new title search this morning. I assumed. You assumed wrong, I said, my voice steady and cold. I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone. I hadn't just been checking the news. I had been recording the last 10 minutes. And you assumed that I was the same person I was yesterday. I've spent 15 years sleeping next to a man who catches people like you for a living, Cynthia. Did you really think I wouldn't learn a few things along the way? I hit a contact on my phone. It wasn't the police. It was Mark's SAC, his special agent in charge. The man who had been at our house for every 4th of July barbecue for a decade. Jim, it's Elena. I'm at the Apex Valley offices. I have a recorded confession of a conspiracy to commit wire fraud, identity theft, and the intentional interference with a federal agent in the performance of his duties. And Jim? Tell the airline's legal team that if they don't have Mark released and home in the next 2 hours, the lawsuit for the assault on a federal officer is going to start at 7 figures. I'll see you here. I ended the call and tucked the phone back into my pocket. The physical sensation was strange. My hands were no longer shaking. Instead, a calm, crystalline clarity had settled over me. I looked at Cynthia, who was now backed against the glass wall, her eyes darting around like a trapped animal. You thought you were the predator because you had a uniform and a script, I said, each word a slow, deliberate strike. But you forgot one thing. Mark isn't just a logistics consultant. He's a public servant with a very long memory and very powerful friends. You didn't just sell the farm, Cynthia. You sold your soul, and the market for those is currently at zero. The next hour was a whirlwind of shattering consequences. The double doors didn't just open, they were practically taken off their hinges as two of Mark's colleagues and three local officers entered. Mr. Vance was the first to fold, pointing his finger at Cynthia and Julian before the handcuffs were even out. The environmental seizure I'd mentioned was a bluff, a beautiful, desperate lie I'd constructed from a half-remembered conversation Mark had once had about a neighboring property. But in that moment of high-tension greed, it was the wrench that jammed the gears of their machine. It bought the minutes I needed for the real law to arrive. Cynthia was led out in handcuffs, her sharp black suit suddenly looking cheap and ill-fitting. She tried to scream at me, a torrent of bile and "how could yous?" But the officers didn't give her the stage. As for the airline, they realized their catastrophic mistake the moment the FBI field office made the call. The flight attendant who had bravely reported a terrorist was revealed to be a relative of the passenger, with a clear financial motive to have him detained. The airline's internal security had failed to verify his credentials, and the resulting public relations nightmare was enough to make them settle quickly. 6 months later, the dust has finally settled. The $1.2 million settlement from the airline didn't go into a flashy bank account. It went into a permanent, ironclad trust for Mia's education and the restoration of the old mill farm. Mark is back at work, though he prefers the office to the field these days. He still walks with a slight limp from the struggle on the plane, but his smile is as warm as it ever was. Cynthia is serving time for federal wire fraud and making a false report. She sends me letters sometimes, filled with the same old manipulations, but I don't open them. I don't need to. I already know how that story ends. I'm sitting on the porch of the farm today. The air smells of damp earth and coming rain, but the weight that used to sit on my shoulders is gone. The land is ours, truly ours, and it's no longer just a precious asset to be protected. It's home. I look out over the 100 acres of rolling green, at the way the light catches the old creek, and I realize that the fortress I built wasn't the house or the money. It was the strength to finally lock the door on the people who meant us harm, even if they shared my blood. Betrayal is a fire that either consumes you or forges you into something unbreakable. As you watch Mia run through the tall grass, I know which one I chose. Some secrets are meant to be kept, but the truth about who you are is something you have to be willing to fight for, no matter how high the altitude.